The settlement at Keth-Dovel's southern edge was never meant to last this long. That was what the Compact's Transit Authority told us every year when they came to renew the provisional habitation permit. Provisional, always provisional, as if calling it temporary kept it from becoming real. 7 years I'd been on the fence crew here. 7 years of driving posts into red clay soil, stringing conductive wire, patching the sections where the night crawlers chewed through the insulation, recalibrating tension gauges that drifted with every season change. It was honest work. It was predictable work. After 22 years in the Compact Auxiliary Infantry, predictable was exactly what I needed. My name is Harlan Voss. I'm 56 years old. I weigh 210 and most of it hasn't softened much, which is a fact that turned out to matter. I want to say clearly, before I say anything else, that I knew nothing about the child's situation when this started. I didn't know who she was, or what her family line represented, or why anyone would want to end it. I still don't know all of it. What I'm telling you is what I saw and what I did, and I want those two things to be as plain as I can make them. Wreth came to the settlement 8 months before the night I'm describing. That was what we called her, Wreth, because none of us could manage the full Velsavin designation, which ran to 11 syllables with a tonal shift in the middle that human mouths weren't built for. The settlement medic said she was close to 11 in developmental terms, though she was small even by Velsavin standards. Waist height on me. Pale lavender skin with a faint iridescent quality in direct light, the kind of shimmer you had to be looking for to notice. Wide amber eyes with no visible whites, just solid warm color going all the way to the edges, giving her face a quality of particular stillness even when the rest of her was alert. Pointed ears that tracked sound the way a dog's do, swiveling toward whatever caught her attention. She moved quietly always, with a deliberateness that you noticed after a few days, not slow, but considered, as if she was deciding each step before she made it. Her guardian was a Velsavin man named Toreth who worked the settlement's water reclamation unit. He was lean and methodical, and had the particular manner of someone who has survived difficult things without discussing them. He'd brought Wreth from somewhere in the inner corridor, he said, after the rest of their extended family line was lost in a transit collapse. He didn't elaborate. Settlement people learned quickly not to ask about what came before. What mattered was that he was good at his work, that she was quiet and kept close to the residential block, and that they paid their provisional residency fee on time. I noticed Wreth because she started coming to watch the fence crew 3 weeks after they arrived. She would appear at the edge of the work zone in the mornings, standing about 4 meters back from where we were operating, and she would watch, not with the restless interest of a child looking for something to do. She watched the way an engineer watches methodically, moving her eyes from the post driver to the wire spool to the tension calibration gauge, working out how the system fit together. After 3 mornings of this, I told her she was welcome to come closer if she wanted to. She moved to 2 meters and watched from there for another 2 mornings before she said her first word to me. She said, in careful compact standard with the slight over-precision of someone who has learned it as a second language, "The gauge is reading high." I looked at the tension calibration gauge. She was right. I'd been so used to the instrument's particular drift pattern that I'd stopped accounting for it consciously. The wire in that section was 4% over tight, which over a season would fatigue the insulation at the connector joints. I thanked her, and we recalibrated the whole west run that afternoon. After that she came every morning. I started explaining things when she looked at them long enough. The post specifications, and why the ones for red clay differed from standard issue. The conductive wire's tolerance ratings under temperature variance. The way the nightcrawler burrows followed moisture gradients, and why that meant the eastern sections needed inspection twice a week instead of once. She never asked questions in the early weeks. She just listened and looked. Then slowly, over a month, she began asking questions, and they were precise and sequential, building on each other the way questions build when someone is constructing a complete understanding rather than satisfying a passing curiosity. In the evenings, she apparently went home and told Wreth what she'd learned. I know this because he came to find me one afternoon near the end of the second month and said, with a formality that I think covered real feeling, "She talks about the gauges at dinner. She has not talked about things at dinner since before." I said she was welcome any morning she wanted to come. He thanked me and went back to the reclamation unit. Things went on like this through the fourth and fifth months. My crew, Marin, Davak, two younger settlement hands named Kell and Prace, got used to Wreth's presence the way you get used to a reliable instrument. She was accurate. She was quiet. She had the gift of watching closely without making people feel watched, which is harder than it sounds. Davak, who is not a demonstrative man, started leaving small offcuts of conductive wire at her usual observation spot, not as a gift but as material, because he'd noticed she examined the cross-sections closely, and he respected precision in anyone who demonstrated it. She was at 2 meters for 3 months before she moved to 1.5. That's the detail I think about when I think about who she was. She moved the distance by 0.5 meter, and that was a decision, not an accident, and she didn't mention it. She just arrived at 1.5 meters one morning, and that was where she stood from then on. In the 6th month, Wreth came to my work shed after the crew had gone. He stood at the threshold in the way settlement people stand when they have something to say that they're not sure how to begin. I poured him a cup of the bitter grain brew and didn't push him, and after a while he talked. He told me that the transit collapse that had taken their family line hadn't been an accident. He believed, and had reason to believe, though not evidence he could file formally, that someone had arranged it. Someone with money and patience and specific reasons to want that family line ended. He didn't give me names. He didn't know for certain, he said. He knew probabilities and indicators. What he knew for certain was that the probability he was right was high enough that he'd pulled Wreth from the inner corridor and taken a provisional posting on the outer fringe, specifically to put distance between her and whoever was looking. He'd been hoping the distance was enough. 2 weeks ago he'd seen a Velsavan man at the settlement's eastern transit gate. Not a resident, not a transit traveler with a listed itinerary. Just a man standing at the gate for 20 minutes, looking at the residential blocks and then leaving. He was certain this man had no legitimate reason to be there. He was equally certain of what the visit meant. He was sorry to bring it to me. He said that several times. He said he didn't know what he needed exactly, and that he'd debated telling me for 2 weeks because he didn't want to make it my problem, but he thought I should know. I told him that was the right call. I told him to make sure Wreth was never outside the residential block alone after dark, and to tell me immediately if he saw anything else. He thanked me and left. I sat in the work shed after he went, and I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the math of what he'd described. 22 years in the compact auxiliary infantry, most of it advance work in contested corridors, not the dramatic kind of work, not command decisions or strategic operations, but the grinding systematic work of securing perimeters and reading terrain and knowing what certain kinds of movement meant. I knew what a surveillance pass looked like. I knew what a man standing at a gate for 20 minutes without credentials was doing. He was counting residential blocks. He was timing the shift transitions. He was building a layout. That told me I had somewhere between a week and a month, depending on what else they needed to know and how fast they were moving. I went to Marin and Davak the next morning separately and told them the truth. I told them I wanted to start a rotation patrol of the settlement perimeter, and I told them why. Marin had done a stretch as a compact border auxiliary and absorbed the information with the particular stillness of someone who has been in these situations before. Davak asked 2 specific questions about threat type and numbers and accepted my answers and said he'd cover the north section, which was the most vulnerable approach, because the north fence ran closest to the outer transit corridor and had two sections of older wire that took more time to inspect. We brought Kell and Prace in on the rotation, but told them only that we had a security concern with the perimeter and needed tighter checks. That was true enough. We set up a simple 2-click emergency channel pattern. 2 clicks meant contact in your section. 3 clicks meant you needed backup immediately. We ran the rotation for 11 days. On the 12th night, in the 2-hour window before dawn, they came. 3 of them. Velsavan, not human. They came in through the north fence section at a point I hadn't reached in 90 minutes on the rotation cycle, which told me they'd been watching the patrol pattern long enough to identify the gap. They moved with purpose and without hurry, not military discipline exactly, but trained, practiced. The kind of movement that comes from people who have done this work before and have found that efficiency serves better than speed. Davek had gone early to the north section on instinct, which I have never questioned him about because I am grateful for it. He saw them come through. He clicked twice on the emergency channel without hesitating. I was at the far south end of my patrol route. I heard the signal and I moved. The central yard was 200 meters, and the red clay of Kethdovel gets slick before dawn when the temperature drops and the dew comes down on it. I moved as fast as I could without breaking into a run that would compromise my balance on the wet ground, and I was calculating as I went. 3 of them. Unknown equipment. They knew the patrol rotation, which meant they'd been watching us, which meant they were professionals who came prepared. 3 against 1 was not good. But Davak would be coming behind them at a distance, and Marin would hear the channel click and come from the south section, which bought me 3 minutes before I was genuinely alone. 3 minutes was enough. I'd worked in worse arithmetic. They were at the door of the correct residential unit. The right block, the right unit. They'd done their reconnaissance thoroughly. One of them had a bypass tool on the lock panel. The other 2 were spread wide to either side of the doorway, which was a professional configuration, covering angles rather than clustering. I came into the yard from the east and called out. "Stop!" One word, loud, carrying across the wet ground in the pre-dawn quiet. All 3 turned. I walked forward. I want you to understand something about that moment that I have a hard time explaining to people who haven't been in the infantry. There is a version of that walk that involves courage. That version exists, and I've seen it in other people, and it's real and it deserves the name. But that is not what I was doing. What I was doing was the result of 22 years of conditioning that trained the body and the mind to move toward problems and work them. Walking toward 3 professionals at a door was not a decision that required overcoming fear. The override had been installed so long ago, I didn't feel it any more as override. It was simply what the body did. The tall one on my left, the one with the most command posture, said something in Velsavan that I caught partially. The register was, "Identify yourself and state your authority." I said in standard, slowly and clearly, "Fence crew chief, this is a provisional residential settlement. You have no listed itinerary in the settlement register. State your purpose." The tall one said in standard, "We hold a transit warrant for a resident of this settlement. This is a compact legal instrument, and you are not authorized to obstruct it." I said, "Show me the warrant." He said, "It is filed with the Compact Transit Authority at Kethsovel. The sealed endorsement is in transit." I said, "A warrant filed at Kethsovel without the sealed endorsement present is not executable in a provisional settlement. You know that, I know that, which means you're not executing it tonight. Leave now." There was a silence. The kind of silence where people are deciding. The one on his right, shorter, faster looking, the one I'd already identified as the likely first mover, took a step toward me. I had already assessed all 3. Trained but not infantry. The tall one was the decision-maker. The one on the left was carrying at least one sidearm and was positioned to cover rather than to move, which meant he'd hold unless the tall one signaled otherwise. The one who stepped toward me was the one they designated to close with any obstacle. I moved into it before he'd completed the step. 8 seconds, possibly less. The one who'd stepped toward me was on the ground with his arm in a position that strongly discouraged independent movement. The tall one had not moved because he had read the 8 seconds correctly. The one on the left had his hand near the sidearm and was waiting for instruction. I said with my full weight on the situation, left hand down, both hands where I can see them. He put them down. I was breathing harder than I wanted to be. 56 years old, 200 meters at a run in the pre-dawn dark on wet clay. But my voice was steady and my position was solid, and the one on the ground was making a careful assessment of whether moving was going to help his situation, which it was not. I said, I'm going to say this once. The child you're looking for is a resident of this settlement under valid provisional habitation status. Her guardian is also a resident under valid provisional habitation status. You have brought no instrument I can inspect, which means you have no legal authority I am obligated to recognize. You are going to leave this settlement tonight. You are not going to come back. The tall one looked at me. He was running the calculation. He was professional enough to run it correctly, which meant he was arriving at the conclusion that I was an obstacle he hadn't planned for, that tonight's attempt had been compromised, and that attempting to push through a compromised operation against an unknown security variable was a losing proposition. He said, "This matter is not concluded." I said, "For tonight it is, go." He said something in Velsavin to the one on the ground, who got up carefully and was careful about his arm while doing it. The three of them moved toward the north fence. I watched them go. Davek came up beside me and said nothing for a moment and then said, quietly, "I've got the north section." I said, "Stay on it until they're clear." He went. I stood in the yard and held the space. The thing about an action like that one is that it doesn't end when the threat leaves. The threat has left, but the yard is still the yard, and the residential block is still the residential block, and the work that keeps the child safe on the 3rd night and the 7th night and the month after that is different from the work that kept her safe tonight. I was thinking about that as I stood there in the wet pre-dawn quiet. I had handled one night. One night was not a solution. Marin appeared from the south path. She read the situation in 2 seconds, the way she always does, and said, "Status." I said they left, 3 individuals. Compact transit warrant claimed but no sealed endorsement on hand. They're professionals. They've been watching the patrol pattern. She said, "So they'll come back differently." I said, "They'll come back or they'll try another approach. We need the record built before they do." I told her to go wake the settlement administrator. She went. I stayed in the yard. I needed the open ground and the feel of the settlement around me, the block at my back, the wire at the perimeter, the clay that smelled of iron and the cold that had settled in the last hour. I ran through the action in my mind, not to relive it but to inventory it. What had they seen? What had they learned about our response? What would they do differently next time? Sivketh, the settlement administrator, came out 10 minutes later in her work clothes. She was a Velthoran woman in her late 40s with a calm that came from competence rather than temperament. She had the manner of someone who has handled difficult administrative situations and knows the difference between a problem that panics and a problem that needs a clear sequence of actions taken in the right order. She listened to my full account. She asked 3 specific questions about the warrant claim and the language the tall one had used. I gave her the exact phrasing I remembered. She was quiet for a moment after that, and then she said, "A transit warrant filed at Kethsoval without the sealed endorsement from the Compact Legal Coordination Office is not executable in a provisional settlement. They would have known that." I said I had assumed so. She said, "Which means they came tonight hoping not to encounter someone who knew it. They came expecting the path of least resistance." She paused. They chose the wrong settlement. I said they may try a different approach, legal challenge to the residency status, filing through a different channel. She nodded. She said, the emergency settlement status alert activates a 72-hour notification window for any instrument filed against a named resident. I'll file it at first light. That gives us 72 hours where nothing can move without my office being notified first. She said, that gives us time to get Toreth's case to the compact legal aid office in Kethsoval. I said Toreth didn't want to draw attention. She said, I understand his reasoning, but attention from the right offices creates a record. A record is harder to move around than a single man in a yard. Both things are necessary. You were necessary tonight. The record will be necessary next week. She looked at me directly. You can't be in the yard every night indefinitely. I said I knew that. She said, I'll handle the legal pathway. You keep the perimeter tight for the next 72 hours while the alert runs. She went back inside to begin drafting. I drove posts for the rest of the morning after the sun came up, because the work needed doing, and because working was better than not working when my mind was turning the previous night over and looking at it from different angles. The clay was dry by mid-morning, and the posts went in clean. Davek worked beside me and said nothing, which was what I needed. Toreth came out for his water reclamation shift at the usual hour. He saw our faces and said, very quietly, they came. I said yes. He stood still for a moment. He said, Wreth. I said, is sleeping. Nobody got through the door. He stood there with the still expression that Velsavans carry when they're feeling something that their register doesn't release easily. Then he said, you went out to them. I said Davek had the north section, and Marin had the south, and I'd been running the rotation for 11 days. He said, but you were the one who walked toward them. I said yes. He was quiet for a while. He said something in Velsavan that I didn't catch all of. The word I recognized was the formal one for the debt of a life preserved, which I didn't want him in. I hadn't done it for a debt. I said, the settlement administrator is filing the emergency alert this morning. We're getting your case to the legal aid office at Kethsoval. The next 72 hours there's a notification window on any instrument filed against you or Wreth. We're going to use that time to build the record that protects you going forward. He said, and the men who came last night. I said, they'll try another approach. The record we're building makes each approach harder. He nodded slowly. He said after a moment, she asks about you, in the evenings. She wants to know what you're working on when she can't come to the fence zone. I tell her I don't always know. I said that was usually true. I said I worked whatever section needed working. He made a sound that I recognized after a moment as the Velsavan equivalent of a quiet laugh. He went to his shift. Wreth came out an hour later. In the considered way she came to everything, the deliberate steps, the amber eyes already moving to assess the yard before she fully appeared in the doorway. She saw me at the staging area and crossed to her 1.5-meter position. She studied my face the way she studied a tension gauge, looking for the actual reading, not the one she expected. She said, you were here before dawn. I said I had been. She said there was something. It wasn't a question. She had been living in contested corridors since before she arrived at Kethsoval, and she read mornings by their texture the way I read them. By what was different, not by what was said. I said there was something. It's been dealt with for now. We're working on the longer solution. She considered that. She said, you walked forward. I asked her how she knew. She said, I heard voices in the yard, then I heard one voice, then quiet. She paused. You are the one in this settlement who walks toward things. I didn't have a response to that. She said, why? I thought about how to answer. I thought about 22 years and contested corridors and the particular arithmetic of 3 professionals at a door. I thought about what it meant to have the body trained for long enough that certain responses weren't decisions anymore. I thought about her at her 2 meters for the first months, watching the gauges, and then at 1.5, and then at 1, and each distance a decision she'd made on her own timeline in her own way. I said, because that was the right side of the door to be on. She was quiet for a moment. Her ears tracked something at the fence line, a night crawler probably, working at the east connector, and then came back to me. She said, "The gauge on the west section is going to drift high again by the end of the week. The temperature dropped 8 degrees overnight. That changes the clay density, and the tension on the run will shift." I said I'd have Marin recalibrate it before the afternoon shift. She said I can show her where. I said that would be helpful. She looked at the staging area for a moment and then looked at me and said, "What are we working on today?" I said we were doing connector fatigue checks on the north run, one by one, because the north section had taken stress and I wanted to know the full condition. She said, "I can call the readings if you show me the indicator marks." I showed her the indicator marks, the microscopic surface blistering that shows up on a stressed connector before the failure becomes structural. She examined the first 3 connectors carefully, moving close, her nose 6 inches from the surface. Then she moved down the run to the 4th connector, looked at it for about 10 seconds and said, "This one." I checked it, she was right. The blistering was just starting, which meant the connector had maybe 3 weeks before it needed replacement, but was already compromised under high load. I looked at her. She said without particular pride, "The pattern on the 3rd one was light, the 4th is different." I said, "You read 3 connectors and identified the difference." She said, "The surface texture changes before the blister is complete. The light catches it differently at this angle in the morning." Davak had come up beside me at some point and was standing very still. He said nothing. He had the look he gets when something has impressed him, which is a closed expression because he doesn't open that face easily. We worked the north run for 3 hours. She called 6 indicators. She was right on 5 of them, and on the 6th the blister was real but very early, a borderline call that an experienced eye might have made either way. After the 3rd hour, Davak left to get water and came back with 3 cups instead of 2 without being asked. He handed one to Wreth without ceremony. She took it. She looked at the cup and then at Davak and then she drank it. She didn't say thank you in the formal way. She said, "The insulation on the junction at post 47 is showing micro-cracking at the lower edge." Davak said, "I saw that Tuesday. It's on the replacement schedule." She said, "The crack has propagated since Tuesday. It's on the south-facing edge now." Davak looked at me. I looked at him. We went to post 47. She was right. Steve Keth filed the emergency alert that morning. The compact legal aid office at Kethsovel received Torith's case intake 3 days later. These things take time in the outer corridor, and I will not tell you that it resolved quickly or cleanly, because it didn't. What I can tell you is that there is now a record with the right offices. A record that names the family line, documents the transit history, establishes the provisional residency, logs the perimeter breach, records the warrant claim without sealed endorsement, and contains 3 separate filings from 3 separate compact oversight bodies. A record is a different kind of wall than the one I built in the pre-dawn dark. It took longer to build. It covers different kinds of attacks. It doesn't require me to be in the yard at the right moment for it to work. Those are not small advantages. I won't tell you the situation is resolved. I'll tell you it is better structured than it was. On the morning after the North Run work, Wreth arrived at her usual time. She went directly to the maintenance log on the staging table. I'd been making a habit of keeping it there in the morning hours rather than in the shed, because she read it, and she found the entry I'd made the previous afternoon. The entry said, "Connector fatigue indicators North Run, post series 4055. 6 indicators called by settlement resident, junior observer, designation R. 5 confirmed active, 1 early stage. Recommend. Replacement schedule for posts 42, 46, 49, 53. Post 47 insulation crack propagation noted by same observer, moved from standard to priority replacement. She read it twice. She said, "You put my designation." I said a record should say what happened, and she was the one who saw it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she moved from 1.5 meters to exactly 1 meter. She stood there and looked at the north run and said, "What are we checking today?" I said we were going to start on the east section connector review, which I'd been putting off because the east section was tedious work. Lots of ground cover over the junction boxes, slow going. She said, "I know the east section. The moisture gradient runs south to north there, so the burrow damage is heavier at the south end." I said, "You've been looking at the burrow patterns." She said, "For 3 months the gradient shifts after heavy rain, the burrow density follows it." She paused. "I drew it, I have a diagram." I said I'd like to see the diagram. She brought it the next morning. It was precise. It was more detailed than anything in our maintenance file about the east section, with notation marks for burrow density by sector, and a projection line showing the expected pattern shift after the next heavy rain based on the slope gradient she'd calculated from the topography. I looked at it for a long time. She stood at her 1 meter and waited. I said, "This goes in the maintenance file." She said, "I'll make a clean copy." I said, "The copy I have is already clean." She looked at the diagram and then at me. She said, "My father worked with ground surveys. He taught me to read gradients." She said it flatly, as a statement of technical lineage, not as an emotional disclosure. But she had not mentioned her father before in 8 months of working beside me, and I understood what she was doing with the information. I said, "He taught you well." She said, "He was very precise." I said, "I can tell." She looked back at the east section. She said, "The south end first, the density is heaviest there." We worked the south end of the east section for the rest of the morning. She walked at my shoulder, and I let her because she'd moved herself there, and I wasn't going to direct her distance anymore. She pointed out 2 burrow entry points I'd have walked past, and she was right about both of them. By midday Marin had joined us and was taking notes on Wreth's gradient observations without being asked, because Marin is a practical woman who recognizes useful information when it arrives in whatever form it arrives. That afternoon I filed the diagram in the maintenance records with her name and a note. Burrow Density Survey, East Section. Observer. Designation R Methodology. Topographic Gradient Analysis. That evening Wreth came to the work shed. I poured him a cup of the grain brew. He said, "The legal aid office called. They've taken the case fully. They said the emergency alert record was substantial, and that there are 3 similar cases at Kethsoval this year, same warrant type without endorsement. They're looking at all of them together." I said, "That's a better outcome than one case alone." He nodded. He said, "She told me about the diagram. She was very particular about the methodology." He said, "She is like her father that way, willing to come to the same place every day and do careful work without requiring it to produce immediate results." At the threshold he stopped. He said, "You should know the name in the maintenance record, designation R. That is not her full name. She would like to give the full designation for the next filing if it's acceptable." I said it was more than acceptable. He nodded and left. I sat in the work shed for a while after he went. The settlement had gone quiet, the block lights dimming in sequence. Davek was running the north section and Marin had the south. The rotation was lighter now, compact notification windows in place, the warrant claim formally contested, whoever had sent the 3 men through the fence recalculating against a record that made the next attempt more visible and more costly. That didn't mean it was over. I was not going to tell myself it was over, but the weight had distributed. It wasn't just me in the yard and my arm across a collarbone in the pre-dawn dark. It was Steve Keth's filings and the legal aid office and 3 cases being looked at together, and that was a different kind of structure. The settlement at Keth Doval's southern edge was never meant to last this long. 7 years of provisional, 7 years of temporary. And here we were, with a maintenance file that had a new section, East Sector Borough Density, Topographic Gradient Analysis, Observer Designation to be updated to the full form, and a small person who came every morning without missing one, and had moved herself from 2 meters to 1.5 to 1 by her own decision and her own timeline, and drew diagrams of moisture gradients because her father had taught her to read them, and she was the kind of mind that applied what she'd been given to every surface she could find. I don't know how the legal aid case resolves. I will tell you that honestly. I don't know what the family line represents or what stake someone with money and patience has in ending it. I don't know if the 3 men through the north fence were the last attempt or the first of several. These are the honest limits of what I know. What I know is this: the yard was clear on the night that mattered, the door held, the child was sleeping. And the next morning she came to work, and she was right about the gauge, and she was right about the connector, and she was right about the gradient, and she will come tomorrow and be right about something else, and the maintenance file will say her full name. That is enough to have done. That is a good enough thing to have been on the right side of. The next week passed without incident, which I did not take to mean safety. I took it to mean they were regrouping. I adjusted the patrol rotation, changing the timing intervals by randomizing them instead of running a fixed cycle, which is the oldest counter-surveillance measure in the infantry manual, but it still works because predictability is always the exploit. Davek understood immediately why we were changing it. Marin had suggested it before I did, which is the kind of initiative that reminds you why you want to keep good people on your crew. Wreth came every morning. She was working through the east section systematically now, moving from the south where the borough density was highest toward the center, and she had extended her gradient diagram into a second sheet that mapped the subsurface moisture contours she derived from comparing the borough patterns against the clay composition she'd read from the exposed cross-sections in the post holes. I had not asked her to do this. It was the thing she was interested in doing, and so she did it. The way a person of that temperament occupies themselves when they have something they've decided to understand. On the 4th day after the night, she arrived at the work zone and went directly to the east section, without coming to the staging table first. I noticed because she always came to the staging table first. She read the maintenance log before she started work. I followed her out. She was crouching at the base of a junction box at post 61. She said, without looking up, "This box has been opened recently." I crouched beside her. The seal on the access panel had a fresh disturbance mark. Not a break, not a forced entry, but the kind of slight surface compression that comes from a tool being applied to the locking channel and then removed without leaving an obvious trace. I said, "When did you notice this?" She said, "Just now. The morning dew pattern on the seal surface is disturbed. The dew settles uniformly on an undisturbed seal. This one has a break pattern." She pointed, and I could see it, the slight asymmetry in the condensation that a careful person would read as nothing unusual, and a very precise observer would read as a surface that had been interfered with. I said, "Don't touch it." She stood back. I called Davek over and showed him what she'd found. He looked at it for 10 seconds and said, 2 days ago, maybe 3. The corrosion at the locking channel edge is consistent with 3 days. He paused. Someone was checking if this box could be accessed. I said, "Or installing something in it." He said, "I'll check the interior." He checked it. There was nothing in the box except the standard junction hardware, which meant either they hadn't installed anything yet or the visit had been reconnaissance, learning the access points, testing the locking mechanism, building towards something they'd execute later. Either way, it was new information. I filed a perimeter compromise report with Scifi that afternoon. She read it and said, "This goes to the Compact Legal Coordination Office as an addendum to the warrant challenge. Evidence of surveillance activity against a settlement where the warrant claim has been formally contested is a significant flag." I said, "How significant?" She said, "It means the challenging party is actively operating in the settlement without filing a legal instrument. That's a jurisdictional violation. It gives the Legal Aid Office grounds to file an injunction against any further activity pending case resolution." She said it the way she said everything, calmly, sequentially, as if the path from here to the right outcome were a matter of identifying the correct steps rather than anything uncertain. "I'll have it filed by end of day." I said, "How did you learn all of this, the legal pathway?" She looked at me. She said, "I've been the administrator of a provisional settlement for 9 years. People in provisional settlements have legal problems that the standard administrative channels were not designed to handle. I learned because I had to." I said, "You're good at it." She said, "I'm adequate at it. The Compact Legal Aid Office is good at it. That's why I called them." She filed the addendum. The injunction came through 6 days later. A preliminary instrument prohibiting any party associated with the warrant claim from entering the settlement while the case was under review. Violation meant serious consequences for any ability to refile. The Legal Aid Office called Wreth with the news. He came to the work shed doorway that evening with the expression of someone who has put down something heavy enough that they need a moment to understand what it feels like without the weight. He said, "Is it finished?" I said, "The immediate threat is suspended. They can still pursue the legal route." He said, "But they can't send people here." I said, "Not without serious consequences." He was quiet. Then he said, "The men who came could identify you. If they know who lives here, they know who the fence crew chief is." I said I had considered that. He said, "You are not afraid." I said, "I didn't say that. I'm cautious. Cautious means I run the rotation and look at the junction boxes and file the reports. It doesn't mean I'm unaware of what I did and who saw it." He said, "What would you do differently?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "Nothing." He nodded once and went back to the reclamation unit. I sat with that for a while. It was the true answer. There was no sequence in which I would have made a different decision, because the decision I made was the one that left the child behind the door. I was not a brave man by temperament. I was a man trained for 22 years to make one calculation before any other. What needs to happen right now, and can I be the thing that makes it happen? That calculation hadn't produced good outcomes on every occasion. But on this occasion, it had produced the outcome that mattered. On the 8th morning after the night, Wreth arrived at the staging table at her usual time. She read the maintenance log. She always read the full log before starting, from the top, even the entries she'd already read, the way you reread a document when you've had new information and want to see if it changes anything. Then she put the log down and looked at me and said, "I would like to learn the patrol rotation." I said, "What for?" She said, "So I can tell you if the pattern is being observed." I looked at her. She said, "I go to the same places at the same times every day. I am small and I don't look like a surveillance concern. If someone is watching the patrol rotation, they are not watching me." She said it without particular emphasis, the way she stated other technical observations, as a fact about the system she was describing, not as a personal boast. I thought about it. I said, "I'm not going to put you in a position where you're carrying information that makes you a target." She said, "I'm already a target." That was also a fact about the system. I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "All right." She went to the east section and continued her gradient work. I thought about it for 3 days and talked to Scifi. She said, "She's right about the observation risk. A child at the fence line every day is not something a surveillance team classifies as a threat, and she's already in their files by virtue of who she is. Using her for passive surveillance of our patrol pattern doesn't meaningfully increase her risk profile." She paused. "I'd want Torith's agreement." I talked to Torith. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "She proposed this herself." I said yes. He said she is her father's child. He would have done the same. He was the kind of person who couldn't stand being the reason for other people's risk without being part of the solution. I said she doesn't have to be. He said no, but she needs to be. There is a difference. He gave his agreement. I explained the patrol pattern to Wreth the following morning, not the randomized timing that I kept to myself, but the coverage zones and what normal observation behavior looked like from each zone. She listened without notes, and when I was done, she repeated the structure back to me accurately in about half the words I'd used to explain it. Then she went to the east section. She reported 3 observations over the following 2 weeks. 2 were nothing. A resident with a habit of watching the transit gate for a brother who never arrived, and a supply vehicle whose schedule had changed. The third was a Wholesome woman who appeared twice at the East Fence Junction at approximately the same time on different days, not doing anything identifiable, just standing before leaving. I reported the third to Scifi. She ran the settlement register against the description, found no match, and filed a transit gate inquiry with the compact checkpoint at Kethsoval. The woman didn't appear again. Whether the flag had anything to do with it, I couldn't say. But the observation had been accurate and the filing correct, and in settlement security that's generally the most you can ask of any piece of information. On the day Wreth came to tell me about the third observation, she arrived at the staging table, read the log, looked out at the east section for a moment, and then said, apparently to the fence line, "I want to learn to drive the posts." I said, "The post driver is heavier than you are." She said, "That is a solvable problem." I said, "It is." She said, "Davak uses it with the 2-grip stance on the heavy posts. I can see from the grip angle that the second grip is doing most of the stabilization work, not the force. If the stabilization is the critical variable and not the gross force, then a smaller person with correct grip geometry should be able to manage the driver on standard posts." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "You've been studying Davak's technique." She said, "For about 6 weeks." I said, "Did you work out the grip angle on paper or in your head?" She said, "Both. I drew it first and then I checked it in my head to see if I'd made assumptions on paper that I hadn't tested." Davak had come up behind me at some point. He said, "She's right about the grip geometry. I've been thinking the same thing for a month, but I assumed she was too light." I looked at both of them. The next morning I let her try the post driver on the lightest standard posts in the south section. She'd drawn the grip diagram the night before. I could see the edge of it in her jacket pocket, but she didn't take it out. She set the driver up herself, adjusted the lower grip to the geometry she'd calculated, drove the post on the second attempt. It went in slightly shallow but structurally sound. She drove 4 more before the morning was done. They all went in. The last one was on specification. Davak put the driver back in the staging area and said, "End of week, I'm showing her the tension calibration procedure on the new wire spools." I said, "You're the one who showed her the offcuts." He said, "I showed her the offcuts because she looked at them correctly." I thought about telling him that was the most words I'd heard him put together on a personal topic in 7 years, but I let it go. I put the post log entry in the maintenance file that afternoon. It said South Section Post Installation Standard Grade, Training Rotation, Junior Crew Member Designation to be confirmed. Results, 5 posts installed, 4 on specification, 1 marginally shallow. Technique: modified 2-grip low stance, self-developed from observation. Assessment: proceed to standard crew training track. I went to find Wreth to tell her I'd filed the entry. She was at the east section, reviewing her gradient diagram against the afternoon's observations. She said before I could speak, "The diagram needs updating. The rain last week shifted the gradient about 3 degrees west in the center sector. I got it wrong." I said, "You got it approximately right, and then new information arrived." She said, "That's the same as getting it wrong." I said, "No, it isn't. Getting it wrong means making an error with the information you had. Updating when you have new information is how the diagram gets accurate." I said, "Your father taught you to read gradients. Did he also teach you that the first draft of a gradient survey is usually provisional?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He said a survey is what the ground is telling you right now. It isn't what the ground will say in a week." I said, "Then your diagram is doing exactly what a survey is supposed to do." She looked at the diagram. She said, "I'll do the updated version tonight." I said, "Put your full name on this one." She looked at me. She said, "You know my full designation." I said Wreth had told me she'd like to use it on the next filing. She said, "Yes." She looked at the diagram for a moment. "My full designation is 11 syllables." I said, "Put all 11 in the file." She said, "You won't be able to pronounce it." I said, "No, but the file will know what it says." She folded the diagram carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the east section fence line for a moment, and then she looked at me and she said, "I'm going to be very good at this." I said, "I know." She said, "At the fence work, but I think also at other things that are like it. Things where you have to read what's actually there and not what you expected." I said, "Yes, both." She nodded once, with the gravity of someone filing a piece of confirmed information. She went back to the fence line. I watched the east section for a while after she left. The sun was going low, and the clay was taking on the amber color it gets in the late afternoon, and the wire ran clean and tight along the post line, and somewhere in the settlement Scifi was working the legal aid correspondence, and Wreth was finishing his water reclamation shift, and Davak was running the randomized north check, and the settlement was doing what settlements do, persisting, quietly, with the daily work of being a place where people live. The settlement at Dovel's southern edge was never meant to last this long. I thought it might last considerably longer yet.